Good evening, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And tonight, we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 16, The South and Slavery Controversy, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook.
Tonight, we again have Sacagawea with us. So let's get started.
Okay. Well, daily life for a slave varied from region to region, but everywhere slaves worked from dawn to dusk and had almost no political or civil rights. Just as school teachers at this time were not inclined to spare the rod, breakers or slave drivers weren't inclined to spare the lash. But too much whipping would devalue his slaves, so the typical planter didn't beat his slaves on a regular basis. On the eve of the Civil War in 1860, most slaves were located in the so-called Black Belt, reaching from South Carolina and Georgia to Alabama and Louisiana. Slave life in the Black Belt was generally harder than in other southern regions. In places where blacks made up the majority of the population, family life for slaves was relatively stable and a slave culture even developed. Most slaves were raised in two-parent households, but however, in the Upper South and on smaller plantations, forced separation of families was more common. Nevertheless, slaves developed their own religion, with both Christian and African elements. They practiced a responsorial style of preaching, calling and responding with assents and amens. Can I get an amen? All right, never mind. During the minister's address. So, Daniel, were there any slave revolts at this time?
Absolutely. As should be obvious, slavery was as cruel and degrading as can be imagined. Unsurprisingly, some fought back. Though always trying to avoid punishment, slaves would work as slow as possible or sabotage farm equipment. Slave revolts also occurred, though unfortunately none were successful. Examples include Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, the Denmark Vesey Rebellion in 1821 in Virginia, and most famously, Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, in which preacher Nat Turner led an armed uprising in Virginia before being slaughtered. One successful example, not in the South, was the revolt on board the slave ship Amistad, which ironically is Spanish for friendship, where the blacks eventually managed to return to Africa. These attempted revolts led whites to crack down harder than ever, ruling through threat and use of brutal force, always becoming more and more paranoid of rebellion. But Abe, can you tell us about the beginnings of abolitionism?
Gladly. The earliest abolitionist efforts were attempts to transport blacks back to Africa, and so the American Colonization Society was founded for this purpose in 1817. The Republic of Liberia, think liberty, was also founded in Africa in 1822 as a safe haven for free blacks. But when the 1830s rolled around, the abolitionist movement evolved with new energy and momentum. The Brit William Wilberforce, star of Amazing Grace, inspired the Americans by advocating successfully for the emancipation of the slaves in the West Indies. The Second Great Awakening further encouraged abolitionist tendencies against the sin of slavery. Charles Dwight Weld, now spiritually inspired, spoke out to rural audience against slavery. He was aided materially by Arthur and Lewis Tappet and eventually made his way to the Lane Theological Seminary where he debated slavery. Afterwards, he toured the Northwest and preached anti-slavery gospel. And as if that weren't enough, Weld wrote American Slavery as It Is, a propaganda pamphlet. Alright, Sacagawea, could you tell me how abolitionism eventually evolved?
Of course. In 1831, author William Lloyd Garrison published his newspaper, The Liberator, which advocated for abolition and began a war of words with the South. Garrison and others founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, some of whom, such as Wendell Phillips, would go on to boycott slave-made cotton and sugarcane. Other advocates of abolition included David Walker, who appealed for black revolt in his Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World. Sojourner Truth, a free slave who argued for rights for both blacks and women. Martin Delany, who advocated the recolonization of Africa. Frederick Douglass, brilliant author of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and lifetime political advocates of abolition. Eventually, Douglass and others would throw their support behind the Republican Party in the hopes of achieving a political solution. Despite this, abolitionists continually began to arrive at the conclusion that war might be necessary for an end to slavery. So, Frank, what can you tell us about the South?
Yeah, so the South had abolitionist movements as well. In fact, south of the Pennsylvania border, or south of the Mason-Dixon Line, one could find more anti-slavery societies than above it. However, all this feeble attempts to outlaw slavery were quickly shot down, and in years to come, abolitionists would be hanged and beaten as hysteria swept through the South in the wake of Nat Turner's rebellion. Southerners began to campaign in favor of slavery, putting aside any semblance of morality. Plantation owners claimed that they Christianized their slaves and they treated them well. The Southerners then moved from arguing against free people to crushing free speech. And in 1836, Southerners in the House passed the Gag Resolution, which prohibited even debating slavery in Congress, inciting the wrath of ex-President John Quincy Adams. The Southerners then attacked freedom of the press, forcing the Postal Service to destroy all anti-slavery propaganda being mailed to the South from the North. But Abe, can you tell me about the impact of abolitionism in the North?
I was hoping you'd ask me that. Since most Northerners had been raised to revere and respect the Constitution, abolitionists and Garrisonians were unpopular in much of the North. The North overall wanted to preserve the Union for two reasons. One, Southern planters owed around $300 million to Northern bankers, and this money could be lost if the Union were to dissolve. And two, New England textile mills depended on the South for their cotton. Mob outbursts became frequent in the North as extremists such as Elijah P. Lovejoy, the martyr abolitionist, impugned slavery. The South was seen as the land of the unfree, and although many Northerners didn't want to outright abolish slavery, many free soilers opposed extending slavery to the new Western territories. Thank you for watching. Please like,
comment,
and subscribe.
And we'll catch you guys next time.